This is Inconstant. All right, hello everyone. This is a pretty special episode of Inconstant. My guest today is Yusuf Goolam-Hossen. He is a Mill Hill jiujitsu brown belt, primary school teacher, massage therapist, skateboarder, and all-round unicorn on the hot, crazy Matrix. Today we're going to be discussing Circe by Madeline Miller. Miller was born in 1978 in Boston. She grew up in New York City and Philadelphia. After graduating at Brown University with a bachelor's and master's in the classics, she went on to teach Latin, Greek, and Shakespeare to high school students. Circe is Miller's second novel, and it was released in April of 2018. So, Yusuf, why did you choose this book to talk about?
I suppose the first came across Circe when I was about when I was a child. I heard the stories of Odysseus, tales of Odysseus, and in various ways you kind of grow up hearing those stories, and the very reoccurring characters, and Circe happens to be one of them. And last year I started reading. I hadn't read for a very long time, and I didn't know what I wanted to read. My goal of last year was to read books. That was in January, actually, just on the way to the Euros, in fact. I was in Tesco's, walking down the aisle, and saw Heroes by Stephen Fry. So I read that. I read something else, and then I read Circe afterwards, because I saw the cover. I thought the cover looked beautiful. Knew the character, and had always been slightly enchanted by her as well. So that's probably truth be told, I'm slightly enchanted by Circe, and that's why I picked up that particular book and read it. And it didn't. Well, it was everything that I wanted it to be.
So the thing about this kind of the Greek myths, it's one of those things where because it's kind of like one of the basis of a lot of storytelling in the West, you kind of think you know what the stories are about because you've seen them referenced so often in other things, and you get a certain version in primary school and secondary school that might be slightly sanitized. I thought I had an idea of what the story was going to be about, but reading through the book, it turned out to be kind of something slightly different. So I just wanted to know what your initial thoughts on kind of like reading through the book were.
Well, being a primary school teacher, my first thoughts were, as a teacher, and knowing that Madeline Miller is also a teacher, that it was she'd always set her students a task of writing in the first person the story of Circe. And that was, I think, my initial impression. I wasn't quite sure that I particularly liked it either. I think in some ways the writing is slightly basic. However, as I kind of read into it, it just sort of like it lifted me up and carried me along, and I just continued to read it until I finished it. It was interesting that you said about the sort of like the sanitized versions of Odysseus, because one of the versions that I've read, and I went to see a storyteller telling the story of Odysseus when I was about 18, and what's his name? Hugh Lipman, I think. And he's written a brilliant version of Odysseus, and it's got a wonderful chapter with Circe in it as well. And I've read that many times to the kids that I teach, and I've also heard him tell the story of them. So coming to the book as well, as you say, it was, I suppose it was quite a revelation. It was quite shocking as well. So there you go.
Yeah,
is that all right?
I've just realised I'm recording on the wrong mic. Can you just give me a second and I'll...
Yeah, no problems.
Yeah, okay. That's really annoying. really annoying. Okay. I don't know why I wasn't showing that. Okay, so let's get into the book. So I would agree with you in terms of the narrative style and the style of writing. I wouldn't say it's particularly complicated or literary, or I mean, it's not a difficult book to read, I would say. So I think that's quite a nice thing about it, because I think certainly the impression I get is that when you're approaching the classics, they can be quite intimidating, and unless you're really a confident reader, it might be something that would put a lot of people off approaching a text like that, just in case there were words or phrases or references that one would find difficult to interpret. So I think that's one thing that I enjoyed about the book, was that because it was quite straightforward, and there were a lot of references to. So I've got this habit when I'm reading a book, if there's a really complicated or difficult name, I will not bother kind of reading. I'll just call, that character's called Tim then, because I'm not gonna bother kind of like trying to decipher what the phonetical pronunciation of the actual word is. So I did enjoy the fact that I wouldn't say it was, I don't want to say make it sound like it was like Tim and Tom go to the cinema or whatever, but it wasn't the most difficult book to read.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't, and in many ways, it's a bit of a kind of tour of the sort of like the female characters in Greek mythology, and certainly the stories are sort of like that are centered around the Iliad and the Odyssey. So we see a number of different characters, and what's interesting as well, because like you were saying, I actually started referencing everything in this book because I was reading it and I was thinking, really, is this, how much of this is fiction exactly? And it was fascinating to find out that she has taken so many fragments of like ancient plays, and I think it's called something like the Clemistria or something like that, and it is. The Iliad and the Odyssey are sort of like the 9th and 10th part of like this 12-part epic. They're the only surviving pieces left, but there are other fragments of sort of like other stories left, and so everything in Circe, or in fact, near enough everything that she references in Circe is actually based in ancient Greek literature as well, which I thought was fascinating. And so you get to explore the characters a lot more. I thought, Circe was an amazing character because, the story is about transformation as much as it is a roller coaster ride through sort of like all the classic Greek stories. So, it works on a number of different levels, I think, that the story does.
Yeah, it's interesting that you kind of mentioned that this book focuses on the female characters in the kind of Greek mythology. I was listening. I mean, it's quite funny that we're talking about this today. Dan Snow, he's got a podcast called History Hit, and he's just released an episode today called "The Women of the Trojan War," and he was talking to Natalie Haynes, who is the author of A Thousand Ships, which is a telling of the Trojan War from the all-female perspective. And in the podcast, he talks about kind of a lot of the action in the Iliad, and she says like the Iliad's kind of like covers like a 2-3 month period in a war that lasts 10 years, and it's all kind of from the perspective of the blokes in the field, and all the actual human drama actually happens within Troy, and kind of it's all centered around how kind of all these female characters kind of interact with each other and what the men in this world are subjecting them to. So I think it's quite interesting. You've got this book, you've got Haynes's book, and then I think we were talking before about Margaret Atwood's kind of interpretation of the Greek myths as well. So I think it's quite interesting that there's kind of, I wouldn't necessarily a feminist angle on it, but just kind of bringing women further into the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. The my sort of like my reading last year was entirely Greek mythology, and I read a number of books. I read another one. Sorry, what was the name of the other author?
I think it's Natalie Haynes.
Natalie Haynes, right. So there was another one as well, written by Pat Barker, called The Silence of the Girls. And it tells the story of the pronunciation I always get wrong, but it's Briseis, Briseis, who is the prize of honour that Achilles receives once he's sat like one of the cities next to Troy, and he is given Briseis, and the story starts with her watching her brothers being butchered by Achilles, and her having to then, be his prize, and it's fascinating. So I kind of read that one, which again I referenced as much as I possibly could, because it literally taken the story of from the Iliad, like certain elements from it, and I was thinking, really, is this really happened in the Iliad? And this kind of got me kind of thinking about those ancient texts and what they were really like. And I also read Madeline Miller's first book, The Songs of Achilles, which, although centered on the relationship between Patroclus and Achilles, Briseis again appears in that, and the story is very much told from her point of view. So, yes, you were saying about the, don't want to call them feminist literature, but I suppose they are. I suppose that's for the feminists to decide. I'm happy to have read them.
Yeah.
And I was happy to have considered those stories, those ones where you think about Greek heroes being all powerful men, actually, being quite savage and quite base in, everything that they do, and the women who suffer for it. Throughout all of these stories, and one of the examples is where Briseis is taken from Achilles as his prize of honor, and Agamemnon takes her as his prize, and Achilles is so offended because his honor, this is it, his honor has been kind of been offended. It's not the fact that it's Briseis. Briseis is just a prize. She's nothing more than a prize. And this is the women in Greek literature. There's certainly the Iliad and the Odyssey as well. And I think that these writers have all responded to those books and written their own. And you've got Circe, who has an amazing story.
Yeah, it was just quite interesting listening to sort of Natalie's point of view on this, because she was saying that people have got this idea that there's one version of Greek mythology, and there's kind of like, the way she explained it was that there are so many sources with diverging different kind of origins around what happened around that period, and they were all, some of them are contradictory. And she was explaining there's one version of Helen's story, for example, where she gets transported to Egypt the entire period of the Trojan War, and it kind of like kind of a mirage or a hologram is put in a place in Troy. So there's kind of, you've got all these contradictory storytelling. So I think it's really important that we do go and look back at these, because these stories have lasted for a reason. They speak to something deep within Western culture about what it is to be, and kind of the way that we should kind of conduct ourselves. So I think it's quite interesting, the point you made about the heroic Greek men. Quite often held aloft as these paragons that we should try and reach in our own behavior, especially Odysseus.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, actually, yeah. So in reading Circe, I don't want to give too much away for her, but Odysseus appears in the story, which of course he will if you're telling the story of Circe.
Yeah.
So any viewers listening, unfortunately, the spoiler is already in.
Yeah, we're spoiling like a 2,000-year-old myth, guys. So
exactly.
Exactly. So
But you know what? From his heroics that we learn about as children, and these are quest stories and voyage. It's about his voyage home, and there's a very masculine story in there. But he really does wreak carnage all the way through. And when you kind of like actually do analyse Odysseus and the things that he does and the decisions that he makes, man, he is. He's really quite despicable, actually. He does everything to survive. And that includes kind of, essentially killing his entire crew. So he's a terrible leader, which is about 600 men. He's duplicitous. He's, funny enough, there's a chapter in the Iliad where him and a fellow called Dionysus go on a secret night mission. But they go on a stealth mission, and Odysseus he volunteers for it because he likes to kill people in the dark. So this is kind of like who we're getting to meet through these stories, and actually the Penelope is another interesting one. So you've got the Odyssey, which is obviously Odysseus' story, but Margaret Atwood wrote the Penelope and she has written Penelope's story. The fact that Odysseus is off on his questing and he's off adventuring and kind of sleeping with goddesses and poking out the eyes of cyclopses, while she is at home kind of like I suppose like women all the time, it's just holding everything down, keeping the house sorted, keeping things running, bringing up Telemachus. And that book kind of explores, Odysseus coming home and the things that he does, and the fact that again the women of Greek myth or Greek stories are secondary to the men who do exactly what they want, which there's a whole chapter on Xenia, which is about hospitality, which is a whole different subject.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting that you put it that way. So I think agency is quite agency for women in these stories can be quite limited, but I do think when they do take action, it's often devastating and powerful. Kind of you hear the Agamemnon's wife kind of like waiting for him to come home so she can kind of like murder him, and kind of initially it does see, I would say a lot of the kind of the women's agency in kind of Greek myths is kind of reactive, but it's there underneath the surface, and they do have to tend to kind of bide their time until they've got enough power to do what they want to do. I mean, I think that's kind of one of the things that kind of runs through the Circe a lot. One of the themes is that she has to wait a really long time until she's in a position in which she can kind of do what she actually wants to do, and this kind of suffering a lot of the kind of blows that fate and her family bring down upon her. So I don't know what you think about that.
It's yes, and she has to wait thousands upon thousands of years. It's and actually as the story is told, it's it's an interesting life. I don't know whether the actions of the different women of Greek mythology are reactive. So you mentioned who did you mention just then? You mentioned,
Agamemnon's wife. Don't ask me to.
Yeah, and I can't remember his wife's name. Clemistria, maybe I can't remember.
Yeah.
But she, I think, murders him, doesn't she?
Yeah.
And then there are the other stories. There's who is it? Jason turns up in Circe. Jason, yes. And is it? It's not Medea, is it?
No, it's oh God, I've forgotten her name. Ariadne.
Yeah,
is it Ariadne?
Yeah, I think it is Ariadne, isn't it? Yeah, Jason and the no, it's not Ariadne. It's Theseus. He leaves her on the island, doesn't he? Jason, I can't remember. Anyway, so she, and because these women, these particular women that do turn up, and I can't remember the other one who turns up in the story, who's the mother of the Minotaur. What's her name? Padera, I can't remember.
Yeah.
Anyway, but all of them have to take such sort of like drastic action. I don't think it's reactionary. I think that they are pushed to the wall. They are pushed to their limits before they do something. So Jason's, and I feel terrible because I can remember Jason's name, but I can't remember.
Is Medea, isn't it?
I think it is Medea.
Yeah, it must be Medea,
if it is. But so Medea does two things. So she chops up her brother in front of her, and the ship, and throws him to the fish. And that's not reactionary. It is literally a last-ditch kind of thing to do. And again, what she does in the story with Medea, is it Medea? Yeah. Is that she kills her own children.
Yes.
Because she has, it's all that she can do, and it's such a sort of like a deep and powerful statement that and these are, and I suppose it speaks of just the of the desperate time, the desperation that women are kind of are in. In those times, and actually, I think those messages, actually do resonate through time as well. So the story of Medea, that she kills her own children, is incredible, but it's her speech at the end when she kind of explains herself and what she does it for. It absolutely it stands the test of time. And then there's kind of moving away from Greek literature. There's Toni Morrison's Beloved, which it is around the fact that she, kills her baby rather than allows it to grow up into slavery.
Yeah.
Which, it's fascinating. Yeah. Fascinating story.
There's there is kind of a weird, I wouldn't say. So reading this book made me realise how kind of weird Greek mythology actually is, and kind of one of the stranger themes that I found kind of running through this book and kind of looking back. Running through Greek mythology as a whole is kind of parents actually killing their own children, kind of for fear that their children might destroy them. Kind of this, the idea of Zeus destroying Kronos, and then I think you see this kind of like quite often. Zeus is really paranoid about any little, certainly in the book of Circe by Miller, he's so paranoid about any kind of threat to his possible power, and that's one of the reasons why he proclaims that Circe's father Helios can have no more children with his with Circe's mother, for the fear of creating more witches and wizards that will have the potentially have the power to kind of overthrow the gods in the end.
Yeah, I mean that was it, wasn't it? It was when that was like revealed, And again, I thought that was what I thought was wonderful about it, was that we kind of meet this character who is considered ugly by the gods, and the sound that she makes when she speaks is described as being kind of like a horrible scratching sound, but she has the voice of a human being. And I thought, and then and again, you said something earlier about that. You know, she's completely weak at the beginning. She has no idea about her power, and you know, and that takes that whole time to build up. It's I thought it was great. Sorry, I forgot your question. I got lost in that.
Yeah, I was just kind of wandering around about the
The
theme of
fathers and
children.
sons. Do you know
Fathers
what?
and sons. Well, children's and
Yeah.
Mothers and daughters as well. Kind of is another
Well,
theme
exactly.
that goes
But
into it.
then I think that in all these stories, and I did sort of like read beyond Circe, and I did end up reading the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, like the actual ancient text, because I've read these, kind of versions of the female characters, and I was fascinated by it, and I actually did want to find out about the source material, and actually I think in many ways that the Greeks didn't talk about many weird things. Actually, they talked about human nature. The gods reflect sort of like every facet of man, and that they're neither good nor bad. They just are, and they do what they do. It doesn't matter whether they do it or not. But us humans, and we kind of almost reflect all of those. So all those characteristics that the gods have, their kind of like happiness, their sadnesses, their mischievousness, their envy, their greed, their lust, their avarice, all those types of things. They're just reflections of ourselves. So the stories are timeless because they are about human nature. And the idea of Kronos sort of like wanting to, or Zeus killing his father is a timeless thing. It's you have children who will outgrow you, who will who to become themselves have to kind of reject you. They can't be. They can come from you. I think Khalil Gibran said something about, that they come through you. They aren't of you. But they come through you.
Yes.
And I think the Greeks had it spot on. I think they were a real clever bunch. Those Greeks, and their literature is incredible. It's been incredible reading these books.
Yeah, it's kind of quite interesting what you say about children. I don't know if you've ever seen the film 20th Century Women. It's with Annette Bening, and her character has a line where she's talking about her son, and she says, I'm never really going to know my son. I'm never going to know kind of like really what his internal life is like, and kind of like who he is as a person, because I've got to be separate from that. His mates and his girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever are going to have a better idea of who this actual person is, because in order for them to become that person, they have to be separate from me. And kind of the pain of that realization as a parent can be quite, well, her character in the movie certainly felt that pain quite deeply, because you devote so much time and energy and resource into bringing this thing into the world, and kind of to be abandoned by it, I can imagine is quite a painful feeling, even though that's kind of the entire point of it, which is kind of
go
on.
And at the same time, it's there is joy with it. I mean, it's there's that other film, I can't remember the name of it. Terrible memory for all these things, but it was filmed over like 20 years or something, and I think it
Boyhood.
had Boyhood. And there's a scene in it where he grows up and he goes to college, and what's the mother called? What's her name? Annette, Arquette.
Yeah.
Something Arquette, is it?
It's not Raquel Arquette. No, it's not. What's her name? Roxanne Arquette. Is it Roxanne? Something like that. Yeah.
Anyway, it's something Arquette, and
Patricia.
she drops him off. Patricia Arquette, right? So she drops him off, and she sits down in her house, and she just breaks down in tears, because it is that moment of separation. She's, all that, heartache and all that joy, all that love, all that growth, all that sacrifice, to then, in her case, to sit inside the empty house.
Yes.
I mean, it was bittersweet, because he is off on his journey, as he should be. You shouldn't hang on to your kids. You should be letting them go and being there for when they come back. And it's heartbreaking, but then it's also a joy, because you think, they have their life to live.
And I think that's kind of one of Circe's greatest pains in the book, is that neither of her parents really have invested that much time or energy into they're kind of off pursuing their own interests, really. So I think that's one of the greatest pains in her as a character. So I don't know what you felt about kind of her upbringing and how that kind of shaped the way that she behaved later on in the story.
That's an interesting question. I'd have to reread the book, I think, to answer that one. Well, Helios, do you know what? I thought that, so I'm not entirely sure how to answer that one. Let me think about it. What I enjoyed, though, was Helios's house, because it was obsidian.
Yes.
And it meant, I think there was a description in it, that it was like entirely black. And so when he wasn't there, she moved around this cold, marble surface of obsidian in total dark, and that it only lit up when Helios came in, because he was like the sun god, and the place then just shone. He had no consideration whatsoever for anything but himself. So, clearly his relationship with Circe is, a difficult one, because he's just, he's all about riding his chariot across the sky every day. And
his chariot and his bulls, I think, are the two things that he really cares about. So
absolutely. And again, Circe's mother.
No, it's gone. I mean, even if I didn't know her name, I wouldn't be able to pronounce it. So
well, the only name I've got in my head is Semele, but it's not her. And again, isn't she interesting that they're both very narcissistic. They are, as parents, and she kind of grows in the middle as this kind of almost untainted by them. Because they have no real interest in her, apart from when they want to cause a bit of mischief, or when he needs to get rid of her, because she kind of is, almost rocks the balance of an uneasy alliance between the Titans and the gods.
Yes. Yeah.
Other than that,
Yes. Just kind of touching on the other familial relations that Circe's had. So this was not something that I was aware of, but her siblings. Is it Laertes? And I'm going to take a run at her sister's name. I've written it down. Pasiphae.
Pasiphae, exactly. That's it. And Pasiphae and Laertes, did you say?
Yes.
So Laertes is her brother.
Yeah.
Who grows quicker, is actually younger, but becomes older than Circe.
Yeah.
And Pasiphae is her sister.
Yes. Yeah.
So Pasiphae marries who?
Minos.
Who is Jason and the Golden Fleece, and Medea is the daughter of Pasiphae.
Yeah.
And Circe and Pasiphae are sisters. Yeah.
Yes.
So in fact, that was there's a really good example of an interesting, I suppose, triangle of female characters who all have through the fact that they are siblings and related to each other, have this, I think it's called Thaumatica, witchcraft
Yes.
about them. And so each of those characters have, and further into the story, in fact, so it's Medea's own story and Pasiphae's own story. Again, it comes back to that thing about being reactionary. The things that they do are not reactionary. The things that they do are the things of desperation.
Yeah. There was.
Because they in
Yeah. I think my favorite passage in the entire book is when Pasiphae is trying to she she calls Circe to kind of like help with the birth of the Minotaur, and like Circe's like, what the hell's happened? And she's like, I fucked the ball. And I was just like, wow, that's not a sentence I thought I'd be reading in this book. Yeah,
I know. So I'm not entirely sure it fit, but I also thought it was a brilliantly kind of human moment.
Yeah,
and I say human moment when we're in fact talking about like nymphs and goddesses. So and it was like a very sibling thing.
yes,
because they have a real love-hate relationship. I think that, in fact, Circe wants to be loved, and wants to be recognised, because she's cast into exile, and she is ignored by in her upbringing, and she's considered sort of like almost like the runt of the litter. And again, it comes to that sort of like as the sort of like the story progresses. I said at the beginning, it's a story of transformations, and her power, her courage, her sense of self and identity only comes over time. The birth of her son happens, which again, when I was reading it, I did find it fascinating. That I thought, wow, I never knew this.
yes,
And I don't want to give too much away. And so I did read like a whole bunch of sort of like, or did a bunch of Googling on the backstories, and read sort of like who which character was, and in fact, whether it was fictitious or not.
yes.
And there are, as I say, there are kind of like ancient writings and fragments that have pretty much everything in there, apart from the big blobby thing that I won't mention. But,
So like, her son wasn't a character that I'd ever heard of, and it was kind of and it's kind of I was reading an interesting article about why it's so difficult to make movies about King Arthur, and they'll one of the things is that Arthur's story ends in tragedy. Camelot falls, and I think it's probably why this part of Odysseus' story is not more well known, because it does end in tragedy. His kingdom does fall, and it kind of almost falls by his own hand, his own kind of hubris, and his own. It's this idea of when you come back from war, winning the war is one thing, but winning the peace is another. And I think it's kind of another thing that I noticed about the book.
Are we talking about Odysseus next?
I
feel like we're talking, slightly a riddle. And that was really fascinating. So I kind of, I vaguely knew that before I read the story, that, but again, it sort of like demonstrated the very human character. And I think that, again, the Iliad and the Odyssey, we read those as tales of like glory and adventure and the power and the height and strength of Greek elements. but actually, you know, if you draw them down into very human characters, Odysseus was never going to go. I mean, his story is about, you know, going home, returning home. That's what he's focused on. 10 years or 20 years? 20
Yeah.
years. 10 years, in fact. He spends getting home. He's got this idea of what he wants when he gets there. But actually, the reality of that, you know, how could he ever settle down to a ordinary, simple life? He is very much, you know, a victim of, you know, the circumstance he found him in. He, as well as being like, you know, the total snake.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of, it's one of those. Yes. Yeah. It's one of those. It's one of those situations where, you know, he behaves abhorrently, and you kind of wonder how much is that down to his own character, and how much is that down to kind of, you know, things like post-traumatic stress disorder and these other kind of mental illness things that might be kind of like factoring into his behavior and his decision making.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and actually, I'm glad you said post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, that's essentially, you know, he's a man who's been at war for you know, the best part of his life, for half of his life, you know, and every day is like a struggle to him, and you know, getting home to where is it, Ithaca,
Ithaca, yeah.
Ithaca, and settling down. I mean, was it in this one? What happens? Yeah, there is actually what happens. You know, it's all crazy. And actually, if you read the Odyssey, he gets home and he just terrorizes. You know, because he does the suitors in, and again, that's another strand that that's picked up in the Penelope ad, is that, you know, he comes home and he kind of claims his house for his own self, and he hangs like the 9 maids or something like that, the 9 maidservants, because he believes that they have been in cahoots, and you know, the thread running through the story is the questions around, you know, him making that decision and butchering these like 9 young women. And it's a really dark part of the Odyssean myth that is kind of overlooked. But when you consider what he does, you know, and again, it comes back to this thing about, you know, women in Greek mythology being almost just the supporting cast. And all these writers have kind of made them central, and actually they have got rich stories to tell.
Yes, I think that's very true. I think we're recording this in 2020, and there just for a bit of context for anyone who might be listening to this in the future, at the moment worldwide there's kind of a debate about statues, and kind of you know, when you put up a statue of someone that should be admired for their achievements in the past, and sometimes you need to kind of like reassess what those achievements are. So, you know, when we think of Odysseus, we don't think about the murder, the fact that he got all his men killed. We think about this was a brilliant military strategist that ended the war that was going on for a very long time, and he showed tenacity and bravery and trickery in order to survive the war. You know, he tricked the Cyclops, but then had to let the Cyclops know what his name was, which essentially doomed all his men as well. And all, you know, as you mentioned, you know, when he gets home, kind of slaughtering these innocent women, and it's not something that we like to think about. Yeah.
No, exactly. We kind of always concentrate on sort of like the you know, the good in people, but it also, you know, this gets you to think about the whole person, and it gets you to reevaluate all these characters, and not just these characters, but just to, as you say, it's 2020. There's, you know, our leaders have to make very difficult decisions that, you know, are the difference between life and death, much like the leaders in Greek mythology. And you know, if you look at like Agamemnon and Menelaus, that they are almost like spitting images of Trump and Boris.
Yeah.
They embody the same characteristics. They're egotistical. They don't listen to their advisors. They kind of do things almost in a reactionary way. They, in the case of Trump, they kind of deal with their problems, very kind of, well, with military might.
Yeah.
The parallels are uncanny. And
Yes.
so, again, coming back to, the themes of these books, these themes are picked up on the fact that, that there are certain characteristics, certain types of people, and those books that, are the cornerstones of Western literature. Man, I think, in many ways, I think if they'd have been lost, it wouldn't have been a bad thing.
Yes.
The two books that kind of were left behind out of sort of like the 12 of them are the books of war and the books of how to build the patriarchy and how to be a man and do whatever the hell you like. And it's kind of interesting that those are the books that kind of are considered cornerstones of Western literature. Books about like men kicking ass.
So I think kind of one of the definitions of art is something that once you've experienced it, it changes the way that you see the world. And I think with books like Circe, I think it's really important they help us reassess what these stories that we've been told for millennia now, what they actually mean for us in kind of like the in the modern age. So I think that's one of the things I really appreciated about it was, when you first suggested this to me, I just thought, Greek mythology is a bit kind of like old hat in it, and then kind of like, no, but there's room for reinterpretation and reassessing how we should use these stories going forward, and especially as you was mentioning about Trump and Boris and the rest of those guys.
Having read those books, and I read sort of like a number of them, and they were by female authors, and it really did sort of like get me to consider this entire different history. And I say different history from, the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And actually it did lead me to the fact that, once I'd read all these things, I thought, I am going to read the original text. And I read the Odyssey first of all, and that was, it was interesting that this, when I read that, I read all these books, and then I thought, I can't not read the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so I did. And so the Odyssey, I read them back to front. I read the Odyssey because I was familiar with the story. And it was the first translation by a female author, a female translator, in 2,000 years. And it was fascinating because she wrote an introduction that I thought was very down to earth, very, very accessible, but also kind of considered some of the language that has been used over the last 2,000 years and the fact that it's been interpreted and written by men. And so with her understanding and knowledge and her, what she brings to her translation, she reinterpreted certain kind of words and phrases. And that I thought was fascinating because then afterwards I read the Iliad, and the Iliad was written. What was it? It was by Robert Fagel's translation, and I tell you what, like it was so stuffy, and it was like so full of academia, and it was, his writing was almost like one of the characters from a Greek myth.
Yeah.
So I read them, and actually, having read them, and they were long, and they were hard, and they were boring, but they were also really fascinating, especially because I had read all that I had read prior to kind of coming to those, the ancient texts.
Yeah, it's I think you raised a really interesting point about a lot of history being written by men, and you kind of I think it's a good thing that we do reassess what contributions women have made to cultural, technological achievements. I'm just thinking off the top of my head things like a movie like Hidden Figures, where these African American women played an absolutely key role in getting America to the moon. Never heard of them. Men are really, if there's one thing men are really good at, it's taking credit for stuff. And it's it's true, and kind of I think it's good that these women are starting to be, and I hate this word, but being a bit more bolshy about saying, you know what, no, I did this was my achievement, you can bog off. I'm taking the credit for this, and we actually do allow them. Yeah, that they are given the credit that they deserve.
Yeah,
because,
absolutely.
Again, kind of
history was written by the victors.
Yes,
his story.
Yeah,
and it's, as you say, about reinterpretation, or not reinterpretation, but like maybe kind of opening up, other areas of our understanding of history, and that's very relevant with everything that's going on again. At the moment, as you say, the pulling down of statues. It's one of the ways you kind of I think you kind of address that is by looking at the history and start to kind of assess it again and maybe add to that history, especially now that there are more people involved in that history.
Discussion.
Britain, yeah, exactly. And anyway, that'll go on forever.
Yeah, just kind of like the last couple of things I wanted to talk about in the book, because we've gone on for nearly an hour now, and I don't want to do too much more editing. In terms of Circe's journey, what did you make of the ending of the book?
I thought, now, again, it's some time since I've read it, but so I'm just going on feeling, and I think I felt pretty blown away by it. I thought that, I don't know, how much am I allowed to say? Because it's
just
really
talk about it, man. Yeah, like we're an hour in.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody will be listening by now anyway.
Well, you say that when I announced on Twitter that I was going to be talking about this particular subject. It's only 1 or 2 replies, but it'd be the most replies I've received about any topic. So I think I think there's quite a lot of interest in kind of.
Well, there you go. I thought the meeting between her and Circe and Penelope, and Telegonus and Telemachus.
Yeah.
I mean, it was incredible. It was, there was so much about motherhood in there. There was so much about joy, and there was so much about pain. That's what I kind of vaguely remember about the ending, and I thought it was very powerful, that. And I thought that, and if you're talking about sort of like, feminist literature, it was very much a woman's story. I mean, that's what I thought was powerful about it, because actually I don't think I've really got any understanding of any of that, as a fella. Yeah. And I don't want to get into a conversation about men and women and all that sort of thing, but, just really, I don't. I'm a bloke. So, but reading it, that's kind of like what I got from it. I thought that the ending was, and I thought the ending was inevitable, and I think that was her journey. So
I think that kind of wraps up the discussion nicely. I'd like to thank you very much for coming in and discussing the book, especially at kind of like such a late hour. We're recording this kind of like 10 o'clock at night, so and I know Yusuf's kind of an early bird. Where are you working on any interesting projects at the moment, or that you want to let people know about? Where can they find you on social media? All that good stuff.
I can't even remember. What's my social media? I'm Yusuf.G_. BJJ, I think. Yeah, Yusuf.G_BJJ. It's funny, you know what? I sort of like, I don't know whether you're going to be filming or anything, but I've been reading all these books. I'm reading another one at the moment called The Moors Account. You might want to have a look into it because it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And again, it's like a retelling of a story, but it's a retelling of a slave story on a 1539 adventure into Florida with a bunch of conquistadors. That's, so I'm reading that, so I had to move away from Greek mythology. I read a bit of Ovid from it as well, his poetry. And I've started kind of getting into that. And during the lockdown, I don't know what's been going on, but I don't know if you've seen any of my little paintings and stuff like that.
Yeah, I have, on Instagram, yeah.
Yeah, well, I just before finishing, just before coming on here, I ended up doing this today.
Oh, that's amazing, Yusuf, man. It's really good. Really good.
So that's what I'm working on. I think I've given up reading. I find it boring.
Yeah. You need to get back into graphic novels, mate. That's how I'm doing most of my reading these days, is just reading comic books.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I'm happy reading sort of like the books that I'm reading.
Yeah.
And I'm painting, and actually, I suppose the thing that I really enjoyed last year was that my goal at the beginning of the year was to read, and I didn't know what I wanted to read. And I've been moaning at my kids at school, you should read books, and I didn't do it myself, but I sort of like set myself that task. And it so happened that the first book that I picked up was Greek mythology. It was Stephen Fry's Heroes, I think it was, and it was rip-roaring, but it began to make me think and reevaluate the characters. And by the end of the year, I sort of like ended on the sort of like the three big ones, the heavyweights, and I sort of like achieved my goal of just reading, and I read for pleasure, but I also kind of felt like my kind of like knowledge and understanding of not just sort of like the Greek world and mythology had kind of expanded, but my kind of understanding of human nature, because I think that these stories kind of deal with it, and you're faced with sort of like characters who are not just two-dimensional. They make choices, they make decisions. They as do the gods, and so do we.
Yep, that's a good point to end on, I think. Again, thank you very much, Yusuf. Just a couple of shout outs to end. For See-Through Panel, my other podcast about comic books, we are going to be doing Titan, which is a sci-fi comic, and Criminal, which is a crime comic, and hopefully that episode will be coming out next week. And my next guest will be the Ronin himself, Marcus McKenzie, and we'll be doing a comedy interview type thing. Thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe, and Black Lives Matter. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Yusuf, man. Cheers, buddy.
Thank you. Yeah, no, pleasure, man. That was great fun. Really